Thank you very much for the lovely invitation to speak in this amazing home. And I've not given a talk on a sofa before, so if I shift around a bit, I'm sorry about that, but I'll try not to let it distract you. So, I should open with a confession, which is that I have, over the past few years, developed a bit of a habit of taking photos of craft that I see around town, specifically a predilection for snapping adverts, signs and packaging that proclaim a product or a business's craft credentials. You know the ones, mass-produced, crisp manufacturers that say their crisps have been lovingly manufactured, to artisan estate agents, luxury housing developments with names like the Makers Building, chain coffee shops that promise you'll be served by baristas, not button pushers, and which offer the height of craftsmanship. These are all real examples, and that's nowhere near an exhaustive list. Now, the most recent of these is an advert that I keep seeing on the tube for two new products from London-based furniture company Made, the Astor vase and the Ingram dinner set. Now, the ad's copy is devoted to detailing the production of these wares. So we're told that they're handcrafted by ceramic experts in Portugal, using locally sourced clay. They've sat in a kiln for 10 hours, and each piece is different. And the text, as you can see, is accompanied by a trio of images, one showing a hand removing a vase from the mould, another of some Ingram mugs with the kind of excess clay from the mould production still on, untrimmed, and finally an image of the finished vessels styled against a backdrop of material samples. And I kept on coming back to this advert when thinking about today's talk, and not just for the sort of Portuguese-ish link. Because for me, it's revealing regarding the condition of craft today in two key ways. First, that craft is so popular that its qualities are being used to sell or to conceive and promote products from one of Europe's fastest growing furniture companies. Products clearly aimed at the millennial market, with references to the houseplant trend in the vase and also the social media affinities. I don't think I'm the only one that can see Astor and Ingram as some weird kind of quasi-anagram of Instagram. And also on Made's website, it invites customers to tag the company in posts showing how that consumers have styled their ceramic purchases. But second for me is that it reveals how craft is conceived and sold specifically as a production method charged with positive symbolism. One premised on high levels of skill, the use of local materials and building on local craft traditions, alongside individuality and slowness, those 10 hours. Now, our short film on the company's How It's Made webpage gives greater insights into the family-run firm that makes the vase and the multiple steps involved in its manufacture, from pouring liquid clay into the mould to drying, smoothing, firing, glazing and refiring. The accompanying text ensures customers of the company's responsible approach, as you can see, and it says where high quality standards are met and workers are both respected and protected. And interestingly, the design and the design process really kind of play second fiddle to its artisanal credentials. So the vases and dinnerware are two of the latest product launches and what we all know of as craft's kind of huge popularity in the UK and also other post-industrial contexts. And so what I want to explore with you today is this context of products like Astor and Ingram, to think about why it is that we have been experiencing this resurgence in craft since the early noughties, really, and why it is that we ascribe certain values to craft. So this will take us back in time to look at earlier craft revivals, namely the 1960s and 1970s, and then really the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th and early 20th century. I am a design historian, I can't help but go back in time. And that's really because the latter represents the beginnings of what's called modern craft, which is a term used by craft historians like Glenn Adamson to describe the marginalised condition of craft in industrial modernity. And really, it's in looking at the past in the writings of seminal figures like Morris and Ruskin that we hit the problem that underpins this talk, and arguably the current craft revival as a whole. So are the positive values that we associate with craft manufacture really possible in the large-scale production model that companies like Made offer? This is, after all, a company that does not own any of the factories it uses, and whose copy for the vase on the website declares that you can, quote, work the houseplant trend without the commitment by investing in our Astor vase. So we have to ask if that lack of commitment to a plant extends to the vase itself, And furthermore, to its production culture. What happens to the vase when both the houseplant trend and the craft trend are over? And there are signals of both. What happens to the Portuguese family-run ceramics factory when May decides to stop production? Where is May's commitment to these workers then? While the makers and the materials might be local to each other, they are not local to the company or to most consumers. And so selective and ultimately opaque is the information on production offered by even companies that claim to have craft credentials, let alone those that don't. Then we have to question the rhetoric, that underpins this idea of craft. So I want to believe that we can all have craft for £49, but I don't know if we can. And that's really the nub of this talk. Can we all have one-off material goods that are skillfully made by respected workers with local materials at affordable prices? Or is craft a luxury that only a few can afford, and therefore only a few can afford to experience production of? And this is an issue that has dogged craft production past and present, and it's this, as I'll talk about in more detail, which is the Morris problem. Which I should say, in the spirit of craft honesty, isn't actually even my term, but something that came from a taxi ride talking about the problem of buying sofas with this craft historian, Glenn Adamson. I hope you won't mind me borrowing it. So I've divided the talk into 3 parts, where I'll look first at the recent history of craft, then sort of take us back in time to look at the 60s and 70s and William Morris, and then to think about the present again and the maybe the future of craft. So for the first part, I'd like to explore this recent craft revival, tracing it through a combination of social, cultural, political and economic contexts. And what I'm interested in is not so much the activities of skilled craft practitioners, but really the mobilisation of craft, be it by writers, politicians or practitioners in other disciplines. It's really that mobilisation that has seen craft enter the popular cultural arena. And I say that with, of course, the caveat that many craft practitioners continue to practice unabated outside of trends and fashionability. And yet for over a decade, craft really was out of the picture, seen as old-fashioned, irrelevant in the conceptually driven craft world of the late 90s and early noughties, even, of course, as craft skills underpinned the manufacture of many an artwork. And this was also a time that in the late 90s, early noughties, that craft was seen as problematic in gender terms, for women, particularly for feminists, in terms of being associated with these homemaking skills of craft. And of course, in a period when we can think of global brands and logos ruling, even as maybe I won't talk about today, but artisan production really underpins all the manufacture of the goods around us. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in other words, craft is always there. It's just at certain moments we turn to it, we look to it as an answer for something. Now, the signs of craft's impending popularity are there in the early noughties, when Grayson Perry wins the Turner Prize in 2003, garnering wonderful headlines such as the Telegraph's "Transvestite Shocking Pots Claim Victory in the Turner Prize." And you should have seen there are worse headlines than that. And it was seen as a really surprising win, not so much for the dresses, but because it was crafts, not conceptualism, that won that year. And in fact, on receiving the prize, dressed up as his alter ego, Claire, Perry said that, and I quote, "The art world has had more difficulty coming to terms with me being a potter than with my choice of frocks." But we can really say that between 2003 and now, there's no such difficulty in embracing Perry's craft approach. He has subsequently become a key figure in the mainstream cultural landscape, on his way, I'd say, to garnering national treasure status through his combination of frocks, pots and other craft wares, through curating exhibitions and presenting television shows. So if in 2003 craft was entering the mainstream, then we can say that less than a decade later, it had really firmly earned its place. With endeavours like this. You might not be expecting to see some images like this. So in 2010, the Great British Bake Off launched on the BBC, and the programme has just started its 10th series on Channel 4, of course. Now, the programme has proved so popular, and in fact the 2014 final got more viewers than the World Cup final that year, that it has been joined by spin-offs such as the Great British Sewing Bee and also the Great Pottery Throwdown, and all take the same premise: a wholesome programme that pits amateurs, historically a key craft figure, against each other in competitions based on the performance of skill, the winner being the person best skilled in their craft. Now, these programmes have inspired an uptake of amateur craft activity and a wave of consumption of craft paraphernalia, contributing to craft's greater economic heft. And we can see this in, for example, the rapid rise of Etsy, set up in Brooklyn in 2005, and whose self-declared mission is, and I quote from their website, "In a time of increasing automation, it's our mission to keep human connection at the heart of commerce." And amongst those seeking more kind of fulfilling lives are the practitioners who sell on Etsy, including many who kind of talk about having given up the dull drudgery of the office 9 to 5 for the creativity and freedom of craft self-employment. And the growing financial weight of craft in this period is also supported by the Crafts Council, who report that between 2010 and 2016, the total value of craft exports grew to over 4,600 million, meaning that craft actually offered the highest level of contribution, as they say, of any creative industry category to UK exports. Now, signalling this economic importance, in the same year of Bake Off's launch, we actually start to see the kind of government's embrace of craft. So 2010, you get the first ever exhibition of craft at 10 Downing Street. And a couple of years later, you also see craft included in this largely export-orientated campaign around Britain is great, craft is great, sandwiched between design is great, hungover banners of shoppers, shoppers on Oxford Street. And 2011, these seem like such innocent political times compared to today, saw the then Chancellor George Osborne, famously end his budget report calling for a Britain carried aloft by the march of the makers, a conflation actually of large-scale manufacturing and the small-scale DIY kind of hacker-maker movement that is really held up as an innovation driver for post-industrial economies. But he really saw this as the engine to reignite the British economy and its declining manufacturing sector. So I've got all these kind of multiple affirmations of craft's rising significance in the early 21st century, and they suggest that something kind of shifted to make space for craft. And I would suggest that kind of making space can be seen in the broader kind of political, social political context, one that starts taking us not only towards the reasons for craft's popularity, but what it is that we think we see in craft. So I don't think it's any coincidence that since the early 2000s, it's really since the early 2000s that we've seen craft emerging. So in 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed, the firm's downfall, the most potent image, I remember watching this on the news, of the broader global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And I'm using it a bit crassly here as a kind of shorthand for what's been seen as wrong with the current economic system. A neoliberal economy based on exploitation and financial interest. And without wishing to be sensationalist, an economy in which goods are largely manufactured in places far removed from consumers and in sometimes devastating conditions. Witness the horrors of Rana Plaza, home to several factories which manufactured garments for nearly 30 brands, including Primark, in which over 1,000 garment workers died following the collapse in 2013. And it's really in this period that we've been finally awakening to the consequences for workers and the environment of mass production, be it the burning of the Amazon or this artificial lake made of black, toxic sludge in Bautu in Inner Mongolia. The country's mines and factories constitute, together, make it one of the world's largest suppliers of rare earth minerals that are the lifeblood of devices from televisions to smartphones to laptops. Objects too many of us are entangled with. I can't pretend I'm not part of this. Spending our work and leisure times staring at screens, and I see the irony in all of this, being button pushers and not baristas. So this context is, without saying, a kind of oversimplification, but it is in these conditions that craft has emerged, where it's been set up as enriching, as a positive activity that the majority of us have strayed from, with damning consequences for ourselves as individuals and society more generally. Now those are big words, but they're big arguments, but they're arguments that have been kind of underpinning a number of books that have started emerging from the financial crisis onwards as part of a broader surge in craft publishing. And the arguments that they present and the popularity of these books has helped to shape a greater visibility of craft and also the tone that it's taken. So the most prominent has to be the one on the left, Richard Sennett's The Craftsman from 2008, one I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which basically argues that the desire to make things and to make things well is what makes us human. Now, Sennett recognises that there is a kind of ethical ambiguity around craft. So he talks about the fact that actually one of the directors of the project behind the atomic bomb was a committed craftsman. But he still asserts that in learning to become a craftsman, be it in terms of learning to play the violin, as he talks about, or in conducting research in a scientific lab, or even through developing software, being a craftsman provides a template for a better living. If we do something well, and if we learn to do something well, then we realise the desire to see things done well more generally in society. That's his argument, anyway. And we see the same argument appearing in other craft-based kind of popular literature. So Matthew Crawford's The Case for Working with Your Hands from 2009, and Peter Korn's book from 2013, Why We Make Things and Why It Matters. And I don't think it's a coincidence that both Crawford and Korn started off their careers as lecturers, which is my profession, and both gave up the abstractions of the lecture theatre for the hands-on pragmatism of the workshop. Korn expresses an optimism in the handmade that holds these and also other craft thinkers in common, as he says, and I'll quote, "Working creatively with actual materials, bringing new and meaningful things into the world with your own skills, helps us inhabit our humanity to the fullest." So this idea of craft enabling us ultimately to be better people really underpins a lot of craft rhetoric. We see it, maybe surprisingly, in a tweet from the Crafts Council, the UK's national body for the crafts, that came out in the wake of the riots that shook London in 2011. As the Crafts Council put it, teaching teens how to make things may make them less inclined to destroy things. Craft skills empower and provide a sense of ownership and pride. So this is a riff on the craftsman in the real, rioting world that puts the emphasis on the importance of teaching and learning craft as a way to bring up a generation to be both skilled and socialised, two qualities clearly seen as intertwined here. And this political mobilisation of craft is of course most explicit in craftivism, which is the kind of combination of craft and activism, a term that was coined in 2003 by an American practitioner called Betsy Greer, but really describes a kind of a way of making in political terms that kind of goes back to the advent of modern craft. And craftivism is really about kind of both the experience of making objects as being a political act, but also then of course what you can do with those objects. And there are many examples of craftivism, but I think that one of the most potent is the Pussy Hat Project, instigated for the Women's March in January 2016, and which became a powerful voice for voicing protests to the sexism and misogyny of Trump. And I think the ubiquity of hats in the march, and also you see them every so often since then, is thanks, of course, to the availability of the pattern online. So you could be part of this craft community wherever you are in the world, which is, as a kind of side note, a suggestion that the web isn't necessarily kind of destroying communities, but can also bring people together. And craft's political potential is really evident in the practice of artists such as Perry, as we saw, but also Jeremy Deller. So Deller has repeatedly engaged with craft in his practice, most notably with English Magic, his installation for the British Pavilion at the 2013 Venice Biennale, that shows up the ongoing relevance of Morris today. And Deller cites Morris's interest, for example, in broad, democratic distribution channels, as he puts it, something that Deller channels in his art practice, in a practice that kind of spans bouncy castles to making television shows and anti-Brexit t-shirts. So in English Magic, Deller imagines Morris is discussed at the wealth on display at the Venice Biennale, creating a fairy tale mural in which he imagines the socialist Leviathan Morris, what he would have done if he'd encountered Roman Abramovich's yacht that was kind of moored up by the Giardini in the 2011 Biennale. And it was an intentional juxtaposition of Morris's socialist idealism and Abramovich being taken as a poster boy for post-communist Russia. And Deller actually employed a skilled mural painter to make this large-scale work. And this mural painter actually apparently also painted a motorbike for Abramovich himself. And the employment of craftspeople like this is really typical of Della and also Perry, who both regularly work with crafts practitioners in the execution of their work, and also make that open. You know, many kind of art practitioners maybe don't do that so much. So we can say that these are examples that kind of showing us how craft can be political, and that this political character actually can really be tied with questions of production. And the next couple of examples I've got are from professional practitioners for whom the decision to engage with craft is political, but they are also consciously thinking about questions of production in doing so, and the consequences of mass production in particular. So I've just got a couple here. So we see this engagement in a project by Gareth Neal, the British designer maker, who has kind of engaged with a variety of British, in particular, craft traditions, such as bodging, the Windsor chair or the Orkney chair traditions. And in 2012, Neil undertook a project called In Pursuit of Carbon Negative, in which he set out to make a series of furniture that sought to remove more carbon from the atmosphere than its production would put into it and distribution. So in deliberate opposition to the carbon footprint of mass furniture production. So for his materials, he used 2 ash trees that had been felled earlier in the year in a Herefordshire wood. And together with a group of students, he produced the furniture in the same place that the tree grew, using only man and horsepower. And he even cycled to the site from London, his home. He slept outdoors, ate local food, and biked the finished furniture to the shop where it would be sold, quite an undertaking, all in a bid to use no electricity at all, although there was a crowdfunding site that was used to finance the project. But, you know, the kind of massive undertaking of this really shows the challenge of revising our existing systems of production, not least that the cost of such environmentalist production is undoubtedly beyond the reach of most. And this is something that's echoed in a different way from one of the most well-known craft-based design projects of recent years, even if it isn't always thought of in terms of craft. So many of you maybe will know the story, which is Thomas Thwaites' toaster project of 2010. It got a lot of press. He even ended up doing a TED talk. So in 2009, Thwaites was a student at the RCA, and he set about making a toaster from scratch. And he was really concerned at a world in which you could buy white goods, like toasters, so cheaply, how you could buy, and he was thinking particularly of a 2-slice white toaster from Argos for just £3.99. And he wondered what systems of production are implicated in this. So he decided that the best way to do so was to make his own toaster and base it on the Argos model, believing that the cheapest would be the easiest to reverse engineer. He was then quite dismayed to find that this seemingly simple toaster had 400 components and over 100 different materials, all that for £3.99. So Thwaites decided to focus on just 5 materials, and he travelled around Britain to collect his material, smelting his own iron ore, mining mica, copper and nickel, and even making his own plastic, as we see here. And it's worth noting that it wasn't just the manufacturing processes that were a challenge, but actually finding any mines still in existence in the country to be able to furnish what he needed. Another reminder of the kind of changed productive landscape we live in. Product manufacture is not an island endeavour, at least not this island. So for Thwaites, undertaking the making of this product himself was a way to expose the genealogy of mass-produced commodities that normally reveal nothing of their origins. Now the end product of this process, this kind of blobby, yellow, custardy mess with its innards half exposed, could be taken as a sign of failure, of his inability to replicate the manufacturing methods of industry. But of course, actually, the messiness is intentional and really valuable and interlinked arguably with its appeal. It's a one-off visual riposte to the standardised sheen of the mainstream. But also with Neil's project, it shows the challenge of this production mode, because this toaster cost over £1,000 to make, significantly more than even the most avid toast eater would be willing to pay. And I say that as an avid toast eater. So we've got this idea that designers are turning to craft as a way to express concern at mass-produced world around us, but are doing so in ways that are making the challenges of doing so actually visible. The economics of craft production don't quite stack up. So just to look at one example, going to be a bit positive that maybe offers some light on this, will be the architectural collective Assemble's Granby 4 Streets project in Toxteth in Liverpool, which is an inner city area that has suffered decades of decline. Now, the architects worked with a local community group, the Granby 4 Streets Community Land Trust, to refurbish 10 derelict houses, and in one of these they set up what's called the Granby Workshop, which uses craft techniques to produce architectural ceramics and other domestic items, creating opportunities for work, for skill development and entrepreneurialism locally. Now, this project went on to win Assemble the Turner Prize in 2015, an accolade in which it wasn't the craft element that was the prize anymore, but more the architects won this art prize. And also I should say that the wares themselves are available at an accessible price point, and the initiative is even coming to LDF this year. So just, that's kind of one example of, as I say, an accessible price point. But if we as consumers are looking for ethical and environmental modes of production, and we're willing and able to pay for this, then maybe we should think about luxury brands, as they seem perhaps best positioned to offer this, based on the presumption, or rather the hope, that the money we're spending is an insurance of skilled craftsmanship and also the positive associations this suggests. And certainly, we have seen many luxury fashion houses emphasising the craftsmanship that goes into the production of their goods. An early example from this revival would be from Louis Vuitton from 2010, with their campaign that was called Savoir Faire, in which they advertised their products by way of these kind of Vermeer-esque photographs of craft workers making their bags. So one of which has got this young woman sewing together a leather wallet. And the copy, which you admittedly can't read, says, "What secret little gestures do our craftsmen discreetly pass on? How do we blend innate skill and inherent prowess?" And Louis Vuitton aren't the only examples of this. So Ferragamo, Hermes, Burberry have all been amongst those that have kind of put their craftspeople out into the open, let us fetishise their craftsmanship in kind of full light, particularly in galleries. Now, I'll come back to the questions that Louis Vuitton poses and this idea of luxury production and craft in the final part. But I'd like to finish this first section by staying in the realm of exhibitions. So these multiple examples of craft as empowering and ennobling, the widespread popularity of craft amongst advertisers, designers, politicians, the public, consumers, artists in the early noughties inspired one of the biggest cultural and institutional affirmations of craft in its recent history, the power of making, which opened at the V&A in 2011 and curated by Daniel Charney. And it featured everything from traditional saddlery making to rifle making, to artists such as David Mack, whose guerrilla sculpture we see there, to fashion designers, a 3D printer, and all sorts of examples of the bespoke, the amateur, the collectively made. And the show was a huge success. It was free and it attracted over 315,000 visitors, making it then the most popular free exhibition ever at the V&A. But the reason that I include it here is because of a comment made by Charney following the show's opening. Because he noted that, or he kind of asked himself whether the popularity that the show documented, and also then the popularity of the show itself, was due to us being in a requiem or a renaissance of making. That is, does this popularity of craft, this kind of resurgence, does it indicate that craft is here to stay after a century or more in which it's been devalued in the face of bigger, faster, more profit-making modes of production? Or is this interest in the power of making due to it being in its death throes, that we are witnessing the final era in which, as he says, humanity can consider itself makers? So that the affirmative message of the show, combined with Charney's uncertainty, seems a good time to pause, take stock, and take a step backwards. Because the idea that A, craft is dying out, and B, worth saving for its social value, its empowering qualities, has been a persistent element in the history of craft from the first glimmer of industrialisation onwards. And speaking 7 years after the show, it also allows us to ask whether we know the answer yet to its question. So for the second part, which is quite short, I want to look at some earlier craft revivals that will help us to understand why it is that we imbue craft with these values, because this isn't the first time that we've seen craft emerge as an antidote to societal ills. So we see this in the 60s and 70s, when, like today, there's actually this kind of popular resurgence of craft activity. So from amateur associations of craft like macrame and embroidery and DIY, but also to kind of highly politicised practice. And this turn to craft was at a time that again reflected a highly politicised context that kind of has echoes with today. This was, without wishing to overgeneralise, a period of student occupations, the anti-Vietnam protest, and certainly the awakening of environmental consciousness, wherein the turn to craft was in part an ideological opposition to consumerism, to technological progressivism. And craft was positioned as superior morally and ethically, as in a way to have a kind of utopian alternative way of being. So we see that in phenomena like Drop City, which is a countercultural commune established in Colorado in 1965, which is an entirely self-built community made out of DIY domes and self-constructed solar panels, a commune linked with a broader counterculture, which was about manual self-fashioning as a riposte to mass-produced conformism. We see it in the use of craft for social commentary and protest, as in the jeweller David Poston's startling kind of necklace, neck manacle, inlaid in silver with the phrase "diamond, gold and slavery are forever," and it expressed his opposition and refusal to use gold or diamonds mined in apartheid South Africa. And in fact, Poston even gave up his career in many ways as a craft practitioner, kind of unable to resolve this issue. And the revival of the 60s and 70s is also attributed, similarly today, to a kind of a reaction against a turn to conceptualism in art practice, a kind of dematerialisation, but also, and echoes again today, connected with the emergence of feminist discourse that actually embraced the kind of marginalisation of so-called female crafts, the kind of amateur, the kind of embroidery, and these kind of domestic associations. And this is the most of an example of this. Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, which is a monumental celebration of over 1,000 women in history. It really is quite something. Commemorated with this 15-metre-long triangular table, banners, place settings and floor tiles made by 200 female volunteers. Now, I really only touched kind of briefly on the 60s and 70s craft revival to say, on the one hand, that today this isn't the first time that we've sort of turned to craft. But also I want to use it as a way to get us back further in time to the first resurgence of craft since industrialisation seemingly eviscerated craft in cultural, political and economic terms. But of course the reality was far more complex than that. Because it's here, in the arts and crafts revival of the 1860s, 1870s and early 19th century, that we see the formations of craft as we understand it today, is what I would argue. So for me, the arts and crafts movement is really vital, as I say, to look at why it is that we're interested in craft today, and in particular the idea of the kind of moral superiority of the hand. And like the current craft revival, the arts and crafts movement was premised as much on an idea as a reality that craft was dying out. But worryingly for an avowed socialist like William Morris, the disappearance of craft actually meant the disappearance of a way of life, a disappearance of an economy that did not exploit its workers or turn them into de-skilled, alienated beings, something that he thought that the factories and industrial capitalism did. So Morris was born in 1834 in Walthamstow. The son of a stockbroker, he studied architecture, but then would embark on a life that embraced kind of many different disciplines, from textiles to furniture, to being an artist, writer, and socialist. Now, Morris, it should be said, seemed to dislike many facets of modern society. He refused to go into the Crystal Palace, the home of the Great Exhibition, as part of it. He kind of saw it as monumentally ugly, and for him it meant a kind of aesthetic ugliness, but also a kind of social ugliness. And it was part of what you could say was a kind of unwillingness to engage with technological change right at the time of modern technology's growing dominance. And there was a kind of broader groundswell around that feeling as well. But it was this distrust of machinery that translated into its willful opposition in what would become the arts and crafts movement. But it was more nuanced than that, because Morris wasn't opposed to machinery per se, but rather to its abuse in industrial capitalism. As he argued in 1888, as a condition of life, production by machinery is altogether an evil. As an instrument for forcing on us better conditions of life, it has been, and for some time yet will be, and still is maybe, indispensable. So Morris, and like other design reformers at the time, like the V&A founder Henry Cole, he really opposed the cheapened products, the inferior quality, the indiscriminate ornament and the exploitation that the machine produced in a capitalist context. He saw those things as kind of joined together. So he called for a turn to craft, in particular pre-industrial medieval craft, not just in the type of furniture and furnishings he designed, but also in the structures of production, and as in his advocacy of the guild system, but also in the methods and the materials of making. And all this was at best expressed, I think, not necessarily in the messiness of real life, but in News from Nowhere, which was a story he wrote, so he was also a novelist, set in the 22nd century, in which his society has been replaced by a medieval one, that is capital and industry free, a society with no machinery, no class divisions, no private property. Instead, common shared ownership of a manual manufacturing system, i.e. communism. But also this is a world in which the most extraordinary labour and luxury materials and lavish decoration are expended on the most everyday of things. And it's a wonderful book, well worth reading. So Morris set up a number of initiatives that aspired to this utopia, including the furnishings company Morris, Marshall and Faulkner, which ran until World War II, but also, for example, a natural dye-based textiles workshop in Merton Abbey, and Kelmscott Press, which printed many books in 1891. And he argued for a kind of community-based society that allowed for the enactment of what he called useful work for the pleasure of all. That is a kind of ideal structure of craft production. But it was his contemporary, or actually slight elder, John Ruskin, who also articulated the aesthetics and the relationships that a society's economic and production system should engender, and could do so through craft-based production. So art critic, patron, artist, many things aside, John Ruskin argued against the dehumanising effect of man's relationship with machines, but he also considered the morality of the relationship between men, or people, in production economy. And we can see this clearly in the concept of what he called social affection. So Ruskin believed that all economic exchanges, and giving labour in return for money being one of those, should take into account emotional considerations, i.e. our feelings, our inner experience of work, are as important as what we produce in the capitalist system. This means that we should not only experience proper working conditions, but we should also have non-exploitative relationships with our boss, with our patrons, with our customers. And crucially, we should also have pride in what we manufacture, because it should be the product of autonomous, of honest, of skilled workmanship, all very loaded terms. And Ruskin saw this particular kind of workmanship as residing in a certain type of craftsmanship. So in an 1854 book called On the Nature of Gothic, he objected to what he called the perfect finish, which was seen to define industrial culture with its perfect machine edges, and instead argued for what he called lovely form, the sometimes clumsy, inaccurate and highly individual work of the Gothic craftsman or the Venetian glassblower. And Morris similarly distinguished between what he called the true finish, which bore the irregularity of the hand, and the trade finish, because that spoke of the exploitation of the worker. So what things look like is connected with production systems. So the lack of the appearance of the hand was taken as a lack of the presence of the kind of human in work. And this idea of a kind of wonky imperfection is what we see in the overwhelming majority of the craft-based wares that I've talked about today, from Maid's Each One Is Different vase to Thwaites toaster. However, there was a problem, of course, with the craft that Morris and other arts and crafts movement proponents desired. It didn't stack up. The economic model of guilds and cooperative workshops that underpinned Morris & Co. may have given workers a cut of profits, but their goods were sold at prices that were completely inaccessible to most. As Morris himself admitted on one occasion, and this is the most important quote of the lecture, he had spent his time ministering to the swinish luxury of the rich. So the challenge that this presents, this Morris problem, brings us to the final part of the lecture, when I want to bring us back to the present and maybe to the future of craft. And I've called this post-craft. And maybe cheekily open with an example of a product from Studio Job's Robert Baron series from 2006-2007, which was a series of intricately crafted and incredibly expensive cast bronze furnishings that took aim at the excesses and the corruption of the robber baron class of oligarchs and tycoons past and present, a class that they were well aware, maybe, were the only ones who were in a position to buy this elaborate craftsmanship, just as they were in Morris's time. And it's here, in the present, that we see how the desirability to make claims for craft's goodness masks perhaps a different productive reality. So take that Louis Vuitton advert proclaiming the craftsmanship involved in its production. So it came out in 2010, and in 2011, Louis Vuitton had to pull the ad because the bags are not actually handmade. After being challenged by the Advertising Standards Agency, Louis Vuitton admitted that sewing machines were used, but maintained that production was not automated and that it took over 100 stages to make each bag. Nevertheless, the ASA deemed the advert misleading, and I think we could all agree that there aren't any workshops that really look like that. But also that, the lighting's terrible for starters, but also that consumers would think that this was an image that was representative of the production process when it wasn't. And even Made has got into trouble in this respect in the past. I shouldn't say it is in the past. So in 2014, the company also got into trouble with Acer. Its adverts claimed that the reason for its lower costs in comparison to other high street brands was to do with the fact that it had no physical stores, which it didn't at the time. And so it could offer like for like in terms of quality. However, the agency again challenged this, noting that a sofa advertised by the company in this way used different fabrics to the high street sofas that it was comparing itself to, different woods and also different frame structures as well as other details. In other words, not only was the company not offering as good quality, but also it was being dishonest in doing so, something that doesn't really seem in the spirit of craft. And Etsy too is showing the challenge of a craft-based economy. Some individuals find themselves working 18 hours a day to meet the demand for their handcrafted goods, the opposite surely of the autonomy that such craft work promised. And that's despite the unrealistic images that are present on parts of its website, showing the ease with which you can be a working mum. As a working mum, I take umbrage at this photograph. So in 2013, the company put new policies in place that enabled Etsy vendors to employ outside manufacturers to help them make their goods, something highly pragmatic, if not highly controversial, as it clearly doesn't match with the image that we have of the lone crafts practitioner at work in their studio. So these two examples are based on the impossibilities of scaling craft up, of offering craft production for all. But there are maybe possibilities today that suggest that this could be resolved. And that's chiefly because the kind of technology, the industry that we have today is not necessarily antithetical with craft. So in 2012, The Economist wrote an article on the craft revival, declaring that the digitally driven third industrial revolution, as it was then, was underway. We are now in the fourth. And that, as it says, the factory of the future will focus on mass customization and may look more like weavers' cottages than Ford's assembly line. Now, a nice example of this, I think, is Unmade, which was set up around 2015, which is the London-based brand based at Somerset House, which has hacked industrial knitting machines with advanced software that enables them to produce bespoke knitwear for the same price as if it was mass-produced, with the added bonus that customers can design their own knitwear within some design templates provided by the company. Or a company called Unto This Last, named after an 1860 Ruskin essay. Now, the company was set up in 2000 in East London, and it aims to offer what they describe as, quote, the convenience of the local craftsman's workshop at mass production prices. And they're seen to represent how the kind of digital technologies have brought manufacturing back to the local environment, back to city centres. So they have nothing in stock, but instead they simply cut out whichever of their product lines it is that you want to order. Now, these two examples are technological, but what if there was a way of combining the individuality of craft with non-digital mass production? Now, I've got an example, but I'm not sure you're going to like it. Because it's IKEA, the world's largest furniture retailer. So last year, the BBC screened this really interesting documentary on the company called Flat Pack Empire that looked at the workings of IKEA, including its attempts to introduce the handmade into mass production. So one of IKEA's designers had come up with a design for a vase that required human intervention to make it complete. So basically, you can just about see it's a bit squished and there's a kind of thumbprint in it. And so they managed it, it was the end result. But in the process of trying to design this, they travelled to China to talk to some local suppliers and manufacturers. And the programme really made for fascinating watching because you see the Western designers, and they are Finnish and Swedish, ask the Chinese suppliers to make each vase different. When one of the Chinese suppliers pipes up saying, maybe we shouldn't tell them that their products are not suitable for mass production. A worker, and this is a screenshot of my television, is then instructed with taking the vase out of the mould, and he's told that he doesn't need to be careful, that if he puts his fingers into it to get it out, then that's fine. And the response, as his fingers kind of pull the object out of the mould and these fingerprints are on it, is so enthusiastic. Brilliant, they say, a magic moment. Now, the vase went on sale in October last year as part of a larger limited edition series that, according to the company, is inspired by DIY and hacking movements. And as the designer is quoted as saying on the website, a dent from a thumb or the mark of an index finger that fits your grip perfectly when you hold the vase. Maybe you can feel a connection between yourself and the factory worker who shaped the vase. Or that for just £12. Now surely this is the affection that Ruskin advocated, and the mark of the hand, the lovely form or the true finish that Ruskin and Morris desired. So has IKEA solved the Morris problem? Or is this more fake craft, another threat to what we might call a genuine craft culture that necessitates craft to be expensive, to be a luxury? Now, I won't end with that question actually, which is something we can discuss now. But with what I see as the real problem that faces craft today, it's the fact that we potentially won't have any craft makers for tomorrow. And that's because between 2003 and 2013, the numbers doing GCSE design and technology and other craft-related subjects dropped by 50% and 25% respectively. This has been accompanied by a falling number of children participating in arts and crafts activities, a drop in the amount of arts teachers, the closure of higher education craft courses, a new education policy that sidelines design and other creative subjects. I know you talked about education yesterday. So in conclusion, on this kind of wide-ranging talk, I think that we should be thinking both about the Morris problem, how we can ensure companies, production systems and maker consumer relations offer ethical, sustainable goods available to all, but also how can we have the makers to create such goods. Thank you.
Thank you.